Hi class, we're moving on to the last kingdom. This is going to be the Animalia kingdom. It's going to be spread over 2 notes. So the first note we're going to do, this one here, is going to look at different characteristics that help kind of figure out the different phylum within the animal kingdom. And then the last one will look at specific phylum. If we are looking at animal kingdom as a whole, what allows for different species to be within the animal kingdom is that they have to be eukaryotic cell, and we've talked about that a ton. So you have the membrane-bound organelles, you have the nuclear membrane. They are going to be multicellular, and now you're going to start to see the specialized tissue. They do not have a cell wall. They are heterotrophic, so they need to get food from outside resources, and they have to be mobile or motile at least one stage in their life. Not the whole life, but at least at one stage in their life. When we're looking at specific characteristics to help kind of split up the different phylum, is we're going to look at 11 different characteristics throughout this note. So the first one we're going to look at is if there's a spine present. So do you have the vertebrates or invertebrates? Most species in the animal kingdom are actually invertebrates. So when you're looking, you have us, we have a spinal cord. So we are your vertebrates. Your insects don't have one. They are your invertebrates. Okay, then the second characteristic we're going to look at is your growth and development or fertilization. Most animals are going to produce a zygote. So what happens is you have your sperm or your egg cell, and then you will have fertilization happen, and from there you will have your embryo and a zygote develop. There's 2 types of fertilization, external fertilization and internal fertilization. So external fertilization is where the sperm and the egg are released outside the body, and that's where fertilization happens outside of the body. Internal fertilization is when the egg is fertilized by the sperm within the female's body. Usually you see fewer number of eggs or offspring being produced in internal fertilization because there's more kind of care taken to that developing offspring. The next is going to be the number of germ layers. Some species don't have germ layers. Some will have 1, some will have 2, some will have 3. So the number of germ layers helps determine kind of what phylum the different species will be in. So if you have 3 germ layers, such as us, they have an ectoderm, endoderm, and a mesoderm. Some of the species will only have maybe 2 of these. And each of those give rise to different parts of an organism's structure and body. So when we're looking for, say, humans or species that are very similar to us, the ectoderm is going to give rise to the outer layer. So your skin and your nervous system, or depending on what species, it could give rise to the exoskeleton. Then you're going to have the endoderm. That's the inside layers. This is where it's going to give rise to the inner lining of your intestinal tract and your respiratory system. Then you have your mesoderm, and that's going to be the middle layer. That's going to give rise to most of your organs and system. So you can kind of see here, over here, it talks about your 3 layers. And then I will just kind of make this one a little bit bigger, and you can kind of see you have your 3 layers off to the side, and you have your ectoderm, which is your outer layer. Then you have your mesoderm as your middle layer, and then the endoderm is the inner layer. The next characteristics is going to be body symmetry. So if you were to hypothetically take an organism and cut it, how would it match? Would the 2 halves match or not? So if they do not match, that's asymmetrical. It means there's no plane at which you can cut that species in half that they will be 2 of the same halves. So if I look at this sponge here, if I cut it, you're never going to have the same half no matter which direction that it gets cut in. Then you have radial, and it means it can be cut pretty much in any plane, and both halves will be alike. And so this is where you're looking at your starfish or your anemone, and so different phylum will have this specific radial symmetry. Then the last one is bilateral. That's us. When you take an organism and you cut it in half, you should have 2 relatively identical halves. That being said, given that the way the pancreas is or your heart's off to the side, the internal organs will be shifted just a little bit, but on the whole, both halves should look very similar. When we are looking at the next 2 characteristics, we're going to look at your body cavity. So do we have a fluid-filled body cavity? That's your coelamates. And so we do have are organs suspended in a fluid-filled cavity. Your acoelomates means that they're usually going to be very flat organisms because it lacks a body cavity between the cell wall and maybe your digestive tract. The next one's going to be movement. So as we said earlier, to be in this kingdom, you have to have movement at one point in your life. But if you're looking at, say, your sea sponges, they don't move at the adult stage. They actually move when they're young, where most of the other animals in the kingdom, they are actually moving throughout either their entire life or just when they're in the adult stage. Then you'll see segmentation, not always. In certain phylums you will and some you won't. And so segmentation is just kind of repetitive sections. Humans even show some segmentation. If you're looking at your rib cage or your spinal cords, they are made up in sections. Sometimes you'll be able to see them externally or internally depending on your species. Body temperature is another characteristic. So if you have your endotherms or exotherms, your endoderms are warm-blooded. So it means that they use an ideal internal temperature that kind of helps keep everything in the body at homeostasis. The external exotherms or cold-blooded need to use the sun or the soil or the water to maintain a temperature. So if they're too hot, they need to find a way to cool off. If they get too cold, they need to find a way to heat up. And so they have to use the environment around them to kind of maintain a stable temperature. Okay, so getting near the end of them, the skeletal system. So does the species have an exoskeleton or an endoskeleton? Exoskeleton means that it's on the outside of the animal, protecting all the inside tissues. And so that exoskeleton has to be shed or replaced depending on the species, because once it's kind of there and hardened, it doesn't grow. Whereas the internal skeleton, it supports our body and protects our internal organs, but it grows with us. So we have the endoskeleton. If you hear like an insect when you kind of squish it and crunch it, or like think of eating a lobster, you're actually breaking open their exoskeleton. And then the last two, we're looking at systems that we'll talk about a little bit more when we get to the anatomy unit as well. You have the digestive system and the circulatory system. So species can have an incomplete or complete digestive system. Incomplete has one opening. So whatever opening the food goes in, the waste goes out the same exact opening. Complete means that you have two openings. Food will go in a mouth and the waste will leave through the anus. So that's the big difference between complete and incomplete. So incomplete is one opening. Food and waste enter and leave the same opening. Complete means that you have two openings. The circulatory system can be either an opened or closed. We have a closed circulatory system because it means that our blood or fluid, depending on the species you're looking at, is going to be constantly in vessels. It never leaves those vessels unless you cut yourself, and that's not really counting as the circulatory system. So blood is always going to stay within those vessels. An open circulatory system is where the blood actually gets to bathe the tissues and that the vessels aren't completely closed together. So it will bathe the tissues, and then using kind of a pump action, it will get sucked out of the tissues and then move through the system again. And so those are some of the characteristics that help us understand the animal phylums a little bit better.